Today, I want to talk about thinking about others. We've been talking about thinking about God, how God teaches us to think about Him, how He teaches us to think about ourselves, and now I want to turn our attention to others. And I want to look at this idea today of bigotry. If you're not familiar with the word, that's okay. You're familiar with the idea. We're not going to cover every idea that this word is used to talk about, but we're going to talk about certain things such as racism and sexism and xenophobia, things like that, that are associated with this idea of bigotry. Generally, the way we're talking about it is that bigotry is thinking evil of someone because of the group that they are part of, whether that's a racial group, a national group, the man or woman, or it could be many different things. But just because they're part of this group, we tend to believe that they are bad in some way. And what I want us to start with is just the idea that stereotypes, this is the idea that we say, well, people of this group are like this. Stereotypes are not wrong in themselves. The Bible has stereotypes in them. It's not something that is always a bad thing. There's often truth in a stereotype. And it's not always about what's good and bad. It just is. There's a saying in America regarding basketball: white men can't jump. That's the idea is that you really want black people playing on the team because they're more athletic. They're able to jump higher and all of that. And of course, that's not always true. But generally speaking, it is true. But there's stereotypes that that are associated with a group, and sometimes it is even about some things about right and wrong, and even then it's not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to keep in mind that a stereotype about a group does not apply to any particular individual. Just because we can say a group is like this doesn't mean that a person from the group is like that. Let's look at some examples of what I'm talking about. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 15, Paul is talking to Peter, who has stopped eating with the Gentiles because of pressure from some of the Jews who had come. And he's being rebuked by Paul. And Paul begins his statement here with, "We who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles." He's saying, I recognize these, Gentiles are a sinful people. They're not, Jews are different. And he concludes that idea saying, but we need the gospel just as much as they do. We're still sinners. That's the idea in there. But it is true that in their society, Jews generally had better moral upbringing than Gentiles did. Gentiles were generally raised as idolaters. They were raised to commit fornication and do all kinds of evil things. And Jews were taught from youth, from birth, against those things. And so there were, you could say that in general, the Jews were not part of that sort of thing, and Gentiles were part of that. But that didn't necessarily apply to any particular person. Were all Gentiles worse sinners than all Jews? We know that's not true. In Matthew chapter 8 and verse 5 through 12, we won't read all of this, but there was a centurion who came to Jesus, or sent some to talk to him, and he wanted his servant to be healed. So this is a Roman, he's not a Jew. And Jesus said, well, I will come and heal him in verse 7. But the centurion told him in verse 8, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. So he's saying, I understand your authority. I understand that you just need to say the word. You don't have to come yourself. And so in verse 10, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Here he says that this Roman soldier that was often really looked down on by the Jews, he says he had greater faith than anyone he had found in Israel among the Jews. And he says many will come from the east and the west, meaning the Gentiles, to be in the kingdom. But many of the Jews would not make it into the kingdom. In Titus chapter 1, we find another example of what we might call a stereotype. In verses 10 through 14, Paul tells Titus, for there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. So there he goes, talking about Jews. Well, he himself is a Jew. Titus is not, but Paul is, and yet he's saying those of the circumcision are especially bad about this sort of thing. But then he says in verse 11, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not, for the sake of dishonest gain. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. Therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. So he mentions Jewish fables here in verse 14. That's those of the circumcision who are teaching things they shouldn't. And so that almost sounds like a racist comment, except it's a Jew saying it. And of course, we know it's by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But he also talks about Cretans, the people living in Crete. That's where Titus was. And he says one of their own said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Well, that's a horrible thing to say about a group of people. But he says this testimony is true. As far as a stereotype goes, a generalization of the way people there behave, this is true. You know, I can say, I think, without too much fear of anybody arguing with me, that Nigerians are corrupt. You know, Nigeria is a corrupt nation. And yet I know many Nigerians who are not corrupt, who are faithful Christians, who are very hardworking in the kingdom. So what may be true of the group is not necessarily true of any but one in particular who's part of the group. And not all Cretans were evil beasts, lazy gluttons, and liars. He was telling him to appoint elders in every city just before he said this, so that those elders would put a stop to these things. And he gives the qualifications for elders, and which tells us there were Cretans, people who lived in Crete, who fit this wonderful qualification, this wonderful description of what an elder should be. And so, just because they were from that group didn't mean that they were not just as capable as anyone else of following the Lord and doing what is right. In 1 Timothy 4 and verse 7, he says, but reject profane and old wives' fables, and exercise yourself toward godliness. Another translation says, stories fit only for old women. And so, that we even use that expression today in English. We talk about old wives' tales, things that are not true. It's just, some story that, old women talk about. Well, that can be a little bit of a touchy thing, right? So how can you say that about old women? Well, It's true. Many old women will tell stories like that. But do all old women tell nonsense stories? Well, certainly not. In Titus chapter 2 and verse 3 through 5, it says the older women likewise, this is what he's teaching them to do, that they may be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, and not nonsense, not these stories that we're supposed to disregard, but teachers of good things, that they may admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. And so certainly you have old women who are just as good at in their behavior, just as good in their ability to teach, and avoiding these nonsense stories as anybody else can be. So just because we say something about a particular group, we should never think that that applies to a particular individual just because they're part of the group. So when we talk about bigotry, where stereotyping in itself is not bigotry. So what is bigotry? Really, if we're talking about the problem of bigotry, the way that we're talking about this term tonight, it's the idea of believing someone is of low value because of the group that they are in. In other words, we say that we have the idea that they cannot behave properly, or we believe that they just absolutely will not because of the group that they are in. We have that with racism, we have that with sexism, where men look down on women or women look down on men. We have that with ageism, where old people look down on the youth or youth look down on the old people. We have that with nationalism or xenophobia, where if we see, oh, someone's from this country, oh, well, they must be corrupt, they must be evil. Can you imagine how people in Russia and Ukraine are thinking about one another now? And yet they're just people. Everybody is just the same. We're all people, and we all have the same ability to do what's right. The last one I put here is not a real word. I'm not sure what the proper term here would be. I just said moneyism. That is looking down on people because they're rich or because they are poor. Either way. Or sometimes even lifting up. We can even reverse these things sometimes and think someone is of high value just because of the group that they are in. That's also wrong. What causes bigotry? The first thing I'm going to just mention is very often it's just caused by our upbringing. I've heard many racist statements in South Africa from various people, and most of the time they have no idea that they are saying anything racist because it's what they heard all the time growing up. And it's not that they actually have this idea of someone as of low value, but they use terminology and things like that because, well, that's just what they were raised with, and they haven't applied their mind enough to come out of that way of thinking. We need to be patient with such people. Today, there's many people who are influenced by their parents or by the politics, by the schools that they are in. And if they have this type of bigotry towards us, we need to be patient with them and understand sometimes they just haven't thought. They just haven't used their minds. But there are other reasons people come to this way of thinking that is bigotry, or with these different ideas like racism and xenophobia and such things. One is pride. When we want to feel like we're better than others, we start trying to think of, well, I can't necessarily do something better than other people. I'm not necessarily better behaved than other people around me, but surely I'm better than that group over there. And so you get these ideas of supremacy, such as white supremacy or black supremacy, or I've never heard of Indian supremacy, but I'm sure such a thing exists, because everybody wants to think that they are part of a special group that's better than the others. Well, I say everybody wants to think that. Every group has someone who wants to think that. And also we have the idea of we've caused problems for ourselves and we don't want to accept responsibility for that. And so we want to blame someone else. And we see that type of thing happening all the time, but that often comes as a result of pride. We don't want to blame ourselves. We want to pick someone else. And so we pick a particular group that's different from us, that we don't necessarily understand the way that they do things, and we just blame them for what we have done. Another reason is anger. We can feel like a group has done something bad to us, just because perhaps someone from that group has done something bad, and we feel angry at every member of the group as a result. In the book of Esther, the man Haman, who was second in command in the kingdom, he had everyone bowing to him except for Mordecai, the Jew. And when Mordecai would not bow down to him, he decided, I'm not going to just kill Mordecai, I'm going to kill all the Jews. And of course, thankfully, God turned that against him. But that's that type of feeling. And of course, that also came from pride. It's a combination of pride and anger. We see that in our country as well. We see a lot of this from politicians. Politicians love to divide people. It's one of their favorite things to do anywhere in the world. So it's not just Africa. Everybody loves to divide people. But here, we see some politicians are blaming the black people for running the country because, things were so good under apartheid. And not for everybody, but for them. And so they say, you see this group, they've run the country. And then you have politicians on the other side saying, no, this other group who was in charge before run the country, and that's why everything's going bad now. And so you just have people blaming different racial groups, and it's nonsense. That's not how you move forward and do anything productive. But it is how you stay in power, so that's why they do it. And then you have envy or greed, where you want what you believe members of some other group have. And I would say a lot of bigotry towards Jews, a lot of racism, what's called anti-Semitism, when it's directed to Jews, it's often based on envy of their financial success. And so we may not be successful financially. We see them being successful financially, and then we say, well, that means that they're actually taking what should be mine, and that's why they're successful. When usually that has nothing at all to do with it, and yet we can turn that. We can become hateful towards them because of envy of their success in some area. We can also see this on the other side, treating the wealthy better than the poor, where this is what I called moneyism before. And we see that idea in James 2. We're not going to read all of this, but in verses 1 through 9, he talks about two people coming into the church assembly. One is well-dressed and obviously wealthy. And you tell him, oh, sit here in this good seat. And a poor man in dirty clothes comes in and you tell him, just sit here at my footstool. And he says, you become judges with evil motives. And then when you get down to verse 9, he talks about this is showing partiality, treating them differently. He says, if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Looking down on the poor, thinking they're of lower value than the rich, is sinful, and it's a type of bigotry that is totally against what God wants us to be thinking. It's not thinking the way God thinks. So how can we fight against bigotry? First thing, watch what we say. Don't just repeat what people around you say, especially if they're talking about a particular group. It can get into your mind, and you need to watch yourself. Watch what comes out of your mouth. In James 3, in verses 8 through 10, he says, "But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God," or in the image of God. "Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so." And he says, look, you can't get salt water and fresh water from the same spring, down in verse 12. You can't be blessing God and cursing men who are made in his image. Just because they're from a group different from you doesn't mean they're not people. They're not made in the image of God. Everybody is made in the image of God. And so we need to treat them that way. Talk to people and treat them as worthy of your attention. Not just people who are like you or who are your friends, or even people who like you. It may be even people that don't like you, people who have bigotry towards you. But talk to them, treat them as worthy of your attention. We see this idea in Matthew 5, in verse 43 through 48, where he talks about loving your enemies, praying for them, blessing them. And down in verse 47, he says, "And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so?" So don't just greet people who are like you. Pay attention to everyone. And we see an example of that in John 4, where Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman at the well in verses 7 through 9. He asked her for a drink, and in verse 9, "Then the woman of Samaria said to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.'" Well, Jesus was a Jew, but he didn't care what Jews did. He was going to treat her as a human being, and he certainly did. And he set that example for us. We don't have to do what people around us do. We can treat people with respect, treat them as worthy of attention, because they're people just like us. And so in conclusion, understand that bigotry is never going away. It's always existed. It always will. We're not going to overcome it through force or through politics. Here's how we overcome it. We overcome it in ourselves by refusing to listen to the refusing to listen to the world, and listen to the word, to God. So we have to learn to think about others like God thinks. Everybody is made in the image of God and can do what's right, and we need to treat them as worthy of our attention. Just because they're from some other group doesn't mean that we can just ignore them. We need to treat them with respect. And when we overcome bigotry in ourselves, it might help influence others to have God's way of thinking too. So start with ourselves. That's really the only way we're going to overcome this sin. Thank you.